Chapter 3. Merry Christmas, Mr. Heller.
One of my rules for the Nate Heller stories is that I treat the real people as if they are characters I created. By that I mean I research them and let that research lead the way for how I, in a sense, create them as characters. So whether these people, these characters are recognized today or not is irrelevant. It's about them being interesting and credible as characters, not as historical figures. I frequently have said that when I'm about to write a Nate Heller novel, I start with a famous crime or unsolved mystery and research it as if I were preparing to write the definitive nonfiction book about it. But then I write a private eye novel instead. This means digesting extensive book research, nonfiction specifically written about, say, the Limburg kidnapping or the Black Dahlia murder, which are subjects of later Heller novels. Often it entails newspaper research and magazines, publications written at the time the crime took place, long out of print guidebooks to Chicago and other cities. I've talked to people who were there, for example, a retired pit boss from the Flamingo in Las Vegas, who was present when Ben Bugsy Siegel opened that casino hotel. That was for my novel Neon Mirage. That's risky, however, because you're dealing with memories of people, not accounts written at the time of the events at hand. Looking at contemporary accounts is more useful. Lately I have been, but for many years, my friend George Hagenauer was my research associate. He's essentially retired now, though I think he'll be back for the next Heller novel, which may be the final one. We would divide up the nonfiction books on a given topic and then compare notes. He made an excellent sounding board. George was born and raised and lived for many years in Chicago, so he was my Chicago go-to guy. I met him through comics fandom, where we were both collecting original comic art. I often would trade him artwork for research. He was an extremely important part of the process, since an authentic sense of Chicago and his attitudes were key to True Detective and now True Noir. George was on board before I started writing Nate Heller's memoirs. I was researching on my own and had discovered the Nitti raid and how an unknowing cop got pulled in by the two Harrys to back them up. I said to George, Nate Heller, indignant about the flagrant corruption and graft in the Chicago PD, will quit the force and go private. George started to laugh. What's so funny, I asked. Max, it was a depression. You got on the Chicago PD for the graft. That, and other Chicago attitudes that only a native Chicagoan might know, became key to creating in Nate Heller a real guy, not a storybook private eye. Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe was a knight in slightly tarnished armor. Mike Hammer was a righteous vigilante. Nate Heller was just a guy trying to stay alive in Depression-era Chicago, who had lied on the witness stand in exchange for a promotion, and his dream was to head up a coast-to-coast detective agency, not to do God's work. A guy with situational ethics like Nate, when he does the right thing, it carries some weight. And they're lucky. George Hagenauer and I both read a contemporary biography of Dawes, and he was the most boring guy we ever researched. But he was powerful, and a mover and shaker who was one of those who brought the World's Fair to Chicago, and as a former vice president of the United States, encouraged President Hoover to sic the federal government on Al Capone. No Charles Dawes, no Eliot Ness and the Untouchables, no Al Capone in prison, no Frank Nitti in charge of the mob. Boring guy or not, Dawes emerged as an important figure in what became True Noir. I dealt with him by embracing how boring he was, that he was pompous and self-important, but in his way, he was dangerous, and just as cunning as any Chicago power broker. George Raft has kind of fallen through the Hollywood cracks. To me, he's somewhat underrated as an actor because he was not broadly emotive like so many others of the era. In other words, he didn't overact, was more naturalistic. He became a big star at Warner Brothers during the era of gangster movies like Little Caesar, Public Enemy, and the original Scarface, directed by Howard Hawks, and later remade and updated by Brian De Palma. Raft became a star because of his supporting role in the original Scarface, where his nonchalant coin flipping became his trademark. Raft was a dancer, a taxi dancer initially, meaning women paid to dance with him, and a trusted crony of New York gangster Oni Madden. He may have been a gangster of sorts himself, which gave him credibility in his signature role in Scarface. But after becoming a star, wanting to shed his gangster image, he would reject any role that he thought painted him in a bad light. Bogart went from supporting player to big star in part because Raft turned down the leading roles in High Sierra and The Maltese Falcon and, by some reports, Casablanca. Many years later, his last major role was spoofing himself in Billy Wilder's Some Like It Hot. He was great. Janie has a good job working for County Treasurer Richard Daley. She holds Daley up as an example of somebody making good in bad Chicago. Nate dismisses Janie's mention of Daley with a rude remark, but he's aware that Daley is a rising star and is a little jealous. Richard Daley, Dick Daley, is probably the most famous mayor Chicago ever had, even more famous than Anton Cermak. Like Cermak, Daley was working class and rose through the Chicago Democratic ranks. He was very powerful, a real kingmaker, and played a big role in the nomination of John F. Kennedy for president. He is perhaps best known today for trying to show the world how great a Democratic convention his administration could mount, and then getting taken down by rioting anti-war activists. Daley's son, Richard M. Daley, also became mayor of Chicago and served a record 6 terms. I had contact with Mr. Daley when he wrote me several letters letting me know how much he enjoyed the Nate Heller books, despite Nate's rude remark about his late father. I met him once and he was very gracious. When True Detective and the other early Nate Heller novels first came out, some of my mystery writing peers, other writers of private eye fiction, thought I'd gone too far, including things like condom use and after-sex cleanup, that I was too real. But that was part of the effort to make Nate Heller a real guy, not a fantasy figure. I love the traditional private eye, the fedora and trench coat and the bottle in the bottom desk drawer, and Nate has some of those tropes. But I wanted to find the truth behind the cliches, the reality that had led to the private eye becoming a figure of Americana, like the cowboy or the gangster.